Hello, everybody. So my name is Aimane Najmeddine, and I'm a postdoc at Professor Moini's lab at Princeton University. And so today's talk is going to follow along the same lines as the previous talks. Mostly we're going to be talking about this tough cementitious mortar-silicone multi-material composite that we've been able to develop that was enabled by automated multi-material additive manufacturing. And so we'll talk a lot about toughness and how that was improved for these materials. But before we get into the details of how that happened, so the reason why we kind of undergone this project was because we understand that additive manufacturing or advanced manufacturing enables a kind of synergetic approach where you can look at various types of parameters in here, for example, property, structure, performance, and the combination of all this basically gives you this design freedom where you can look into many different aspects. And so, for example, in here, what you see on the right is the force displacement plot for a material that can be enabled by advanced manufacturing. And so in this case, if we look, for example, at a monolithic cast material versus an architected material that can actually be printed utilizing these advanced manufacturing techniques, the idea or the hypothesis is that we can really capitalize on the benefits of additive manufacturing to get these architected materials that have much higher toughnesses compared to the monolithic counterparts. And so this was the concept of architected materials is something that we see very, very commonly in nature. And so nature provides this really, really fundamental example for how purposeful design can be actually achieved. And so you can see a variety of different types of organisms right here that have displayed a variety of different benefits. And so for what we're interested in today is, for example, there's this biological organism that's called deep sea sponge. And I don't know if you guys are aware, but this material right here has basically these spicules that, if you look closely, you'll see this layered hard soft architecture that makes it such a really tough material. And that's because what happens is if you have a crack, for example, kind of at some point, if I can just show my pointer real quick. And so what happens is if you have a crack right here, it'll arrest before it moves on to the next layer, and that's because of the existence of this soft layer in between that acts as an energy dissipation layer that prevents crack from going on actually arrested through the depth of the material, right? And so this is like a layered hard soft material, right? And so it would be sort of natural to think that this is something we can achieve as well with additive manufacturing if we just layer one material over the top, right, over another soft material. And so that's exactly what we wanted to do. So we understand that soft materials, for example, have this really interesting and beneficial property of having high toughness but really low strength. And then the ceramics kind of have the opposite effect, right? And so what we're kind of seeking after is this combined approach or combined design where we have both the toughness as well as the strength sort of optimized in here. And so the hypothesis that we make is that engineering multi-material composites can actually display improved mechanical performance. And you can see right here just a simple force displacement plot, what we think would actually happen if you compare monolithic materials versus hard soft materials. And so the question that I sought to answer was, how can toughness really be improved based on the design? And so again, this example that I showed over here, we have these layered hard soft materials can really be something that we can utilize just by having or capitalizing on this, again, advances of additive manufacturing. And so what you're seeing right here is a 3D printer that we actually just recently we developed in the lab and was actually patented. And so the way how we came at that was we understand that we can print usually with single material extrusion, but we can also extend this a little bit further to look at what happens if we have two different materials or multi-material that we want to kind of make together. And so in this case right here, we have, again, the 3D printer that we built in our lab, where we have multiple extrusions. And so this is actually the AutoCAD design. This is the actual printer that we have at the lab. And so again, you can see right here different types of extruders and how each can actually be utilized to print sort of in a layered sequential manner. And so using that, what we did was we wanted to see if we can print a silicone mortar composite material where we can look at these sequential layer-wise extrusion. And so for example, we see on the left is printing of silicone, and on the right here is the mortar layer extrusion. And again, so this is something that we can really do because of the thanks to the advances in additive manufacturing and what we can achieve with that. And then eventually you get these like really nice composite designs that you can see on each on the sides right here. And so now that we have the composites, and now that we have a design that we can sort of understand, what we want to do next is we want to see if we can investigate fracture toughness in these types of materials. And so what we can do is we can just look at the fractional response, for example, by setting the sample on a single edge notch bend test. And so we can create a notch right here in the middle, and then see what happens as the crack extends. And we can compare the monolithic hard materials versus those from the layered hard soft composites. And the idea right here is that we want to just see what happens as the crack extends along the depth of the material. Okay? And so one way we can do that mathematically is through the J integral. So the J integral is this quantity that's used to quantify toughness. It's an integral equation that gives the amount of energy released in advancing the crack surface by unit area. And so it has this analytical form right here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with from fractional mechanics courses. But we can't really utilize this equation analytically, so what we want to do instead is we actually numerically integrate this equation. So we kind of want to look at what happens if we do it incrementally through a discretization. And so here we use a compliance-based method to calculate the J integral, where the J integral, we know that it can be given as a function of two quantities that make up the total amount. So those two quantities are the initiation component and the propagation component, right? And so by looking at each of these components individually and calculating them individually, we can see what happens to the total response of the total J value. And so for the plane strain notch bend test that I showed in the previous slides, the initiation component of the J integral can be given using this formula right here, which can be, again, this is standard linear elastic fractional mechanics. And then the J propagation can be obtained using this equation right here, which actually was adapted from the ASTM E1820, which is a standard that measures the fracture toughness in elastoplastic materials. Here, KIC is given by this equation right here, and then the APL, which shows up on this equation, is the post-peak area under the notched load displacement curve. And so you can see right here, post the first peak in a typical load displacement plot, this is the area that we consider as being the plastic area that can code into the J integral. And then the crack extension, again, is important because that's kind of what we really want to see and how to measure. The crack extension can be found using this equation right here, which is also something that we can that was found in the literature, but then we capitalized it. We use it for this study. C right here is the compliance, and so the compliance can be just taken as the initial compliance, and so you can take just at each point through the load CMOD, you take the the reciprocal of the stiffness with respect to the origin, and you get the compliance. All right, and then eventually you get this so-called R curve, which gives you the J integral as a function of the crack extension, and then that's kind of what we want to arrive at eventually. And so if we run the test, what happens is we see that we have these stepwise cracking behavior for these types of composite materials, where the crack will initiate at the bottom right here, as you would expect, but then instead of actually going right through the depth of the material, you have this stepwise behavior where crack kind of transitions from one point, or translocates from one point to the other. And then this translates into the load crosshead curve that you see down here, where you have, again, for each of these events, you have a certain peak, eventually leading to a high energy dissipation, which can be calculated as the area under the curve. If we calculate the J integral using the equations from the previous slide, this is sort of the R curve that we get, again, for these types of materials. And if we compare that to the one from the cast, or the one from, if we do 3D printed mortar, we see that we have really high J integral compared to the other two monolithic materials. And we can also look, so we can look at the peak J integral from the plots that I just showed before. And you can see if we just focus on the propagation component, we have, again, such really high improvement in terms of the J integral for the 3D printed mortar-silicone materials as compared to the cast or 3D printed mortar. For the total energy or the total J integral, again, similar behavior right here where we have a really substantial increase that is statistically different compared to the monolithic materials. Again, so this is something that was really beneficial and was really advantageous for us. We can also look at the ductility. In this case, we're quantifying that in terms of the strain at first peak as well as the ultimate strain. And again, we see that we have pretty great improvement actually in terms of the ductility for these engineered composites as opposed to the monolithic counterparts. We can also look at what happens as the crack extends through the materials, through the depth of material used in DIC. Again, a lot of people have showed this in today's talks. But again, we can look at what happens to the cast material and pay attention to the middle right here where you will see the crack going right through, right? Just like really sudden crack propagation through the depth. For the 3D printed mortar, again, similar behavior happens through the depth, but again, kind of less abruptly as that for the cast material. But then for the 3D printed mortar-silicone composite, we see this really, really good and interesting behavior where crack, again, goes really sequentially and propagates in a stepwise manner across the depth instead of going right through the middle and actually penetrating through the whole depth of the material. So again, this sort of explains visually what happens, again, for these types of materials and why we get such really enhancements in the fracture toughness. We can look at the force displacement and the J integral crack extension curves, and if we just take snapshots again along the curves, we'll see that initially we have a point for the crack initiation, and then we just kind of step right through the curve, as you can see over here, eventually leading us to this really substantial amount of J integral that we get eventually at the end of the test. And so we realize that this is something that's really again great that we can understand experimentally, but at the same time we kind of also wanted to see what we can do sort of numerically, and if we have a model that can help us understand what happens sort of more physically and to get better insight. And so that was the question that we wanted to answer again, right? So how do we numerically investigate the fracture in these hard, soft, multi-material assemblies? And one way we do that is we can look at a coupled damage cohesive zone model. In this case, we're talking about phase field as a method for crack propagation. This method was very well studied in the literature for the past couple of, I'd say, maybe decade or so. And in this case, we wanted to see what happens if we implement this code and we couple it with the cohesive zone model to look at what happens at the interface between the parts of the composite. And so I'm not going to bore you too much with the math over here. I'd be happy to chat with you after the talk to kind of go into detail about what happens here in terms of the math. But the idea behind all this is we want to understand what happens if we have a hard, soft, multi-material, and there's an interface between the hard, soft material, and we want to understand how crack propagates in this composite material, right? So the interface becomes an important consideration that all these equations that you see right here sort of take into account and address. And so we can apply that to a simple example. Here I'm looking at a hard, soft, multi-material composite. You can see right here the soft material in the middle, sandwiched between two hard materials. So you can think of this as like the silicone cement that I showed in the experimental part of the talk. So again, that's something that we can look at using the model that we've developed over here. We can obtain all the model properties or mechanical properties for the bulk material as well as the interface using specific in-house experimental apparatus. So again, this is all things that we can do to get the material properties, mechanical properties for the bulk materials as well as the interface. And again, I can talk more about this post presentation if people are interested. And we can run simulations, and what we see, for example, here for my hard soft composite, you'll see, for example, the damage contour right here, which initiates at the point of the initial notch, and it will traverse or propagate through the first layer. And remember how the second layer has PVS, or has that silicone soft material. Silicone soft materials have much higher fracture toughness, therefore you'd expect them not to actually fracture, which is the case that happens over here. And we get this really emergent crack mechanism, crack propagation mechanism, which we call here crack bridging, where the crack actually bridges over the silicone layer to pop right out into second edge of the material. And then in terms of the force displacement, that translates into this kind of behavior, which actually you saw earlier in my experiments that I showed, right? That was actually a lot of peaks because we had many different layers. Here we have 3 layers, so you expect to see one peak where the crack actually propagates through. And then again, this is just a sort of animation for the crack propagation. You can see right here, as the crack propagates to the first layer, it will skip the second one through the middle and then just propagate through the last, and gives us this really interesting hardening behavior for these materials. We also tested the hypothesis of actually varying the thickness of these composites, and to see if that has any effect at all on the response of the overall response. And by varying thickness, I mean varying the thickness of the soft layer, because that's actually what we can capitalize on, right? We can utilize less material now, as we can see, of the soft layer, but still get the exact same response, sort of, by just using less soft material. So again, this is something that we can really just understand using the modeling approach that we have right here. And then lastly, I have this very sort of simple representation right here where I'm comparing the composite versus the monolithic, again, using the framework that we developed. And you can see right here again that you get that sort of expected or predicted response that you would have in the experiment, where we compare the monolithic versus the composite and get this really much more toughness achieved for the composite compared to the monolithic materials. Okay? And so that brings me to my conclusion slides. I'll let you guys read what we have over here, but basically, eventually, what we have is, again, we have an ability to utilize additive manufacturing for the creation or the design of really tough multi-material systems. And we also talked about the development of a numerical framework that can help us understand and achieve better insights for fracture in these kinds of materials. And with that, I open the floor for questions, and I will conclude with this slide over here for our lab at Princeton, for all the really cool stuff that we do in the lab. Thank you.